what we're hoping to do today is give you a sort of an overview of what the program is, why we're doing what we're doing, and also give you a sort of an insight into the kinds of things we're going to be talking about during the program, so you have a better idea of whether or not participation is appropriate for your enterprise or not. So in order to understand corporate venturing as a method of innovation, the first thing we want to do is we want to define very quickly sort of what our perspective is on invention versus innovation. And when I say ours, what I mean is if you look at the panelists here, Karen and Annie are both part of the Compete Caribbean and IDV Invest overall program. Myself and Edmund Pendleton, who you'll hear from here in a moment, are both instructors and coaches in this particular corporate venturing program. We've been working with innovation teams now together for the better part of the last 7 or 8 years. Both of us are serial entrepreneurs. You'll get to know us a whole lot better if you participate in this program. We draw on combined 50 to 70 years of experience in product development, technology transition, venturing, investing, etc. So that's who we're talking about. And the last person on the panelist list is Lindsay Smith, who is the program manager for this one. She is the glue that helps keep all of this stuff running without falling completely to pieces. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. When we talk about invention versus innovation, the reason we want to bring that up is this is often something that people confuse. And when you confuse invention with innovation, it tends to make you lose sight of the proper way to go out and try to innovate. So invention is about technology. Okay, so invention is about creating new things, be it technology, processes, services, etc. When you come up with a new solution for somebody, you're effectively inventing. Whereas innovation is focused around customer need. So one of the ways that we really like defining it, it helps clarify it in our heads and a lot of people we work with, and we give this credit to a friend of ours named Babu Dasgupta, who was working for the National Science Foundation when we met him, and he spent a large part of his career in the automotive industry throughout the United States. And he said, invention is turning money into ideas. So if I gave you a big bag of money and said, go solve a problem, you're going to go through the process of inventing. Whereas innovation, on the other hand, is turning ideas back into money. And that's really what we're talking about when we're talking about corporate venturing, is how do we take ideas that are based on customer needs and turn those into something that's monetizable and creates economic impact for everybody involved. And when we talk about innovation, there are several types of innovation that we can reference. So there's basic research, right? You can innovate around taking basic research to market, right? You can look at incremental or breakthrough product development. So if you've got an existing product line, you probably have feature upgrades, moving from version 2.0 to 3.0. Those types of incremental product development efforts. You've got breakthrough product development efforts where you're creating a whole new product to solve an existing problem. You can innovate on internal as well as external processes. So sometimes the economic impact you can create through innovation is simply working on an internal processes to do things differently as a business that allow you to succeed and be more efficient. And then also you can innovate around a business model. There are lots of cases, especially recently, where money has been made on simply modifying the way that we operate the business model around an existing solution. So a classic example would be something like Dollar Shave Club. That company was built off of the premise that I walk into a grocery store and one of the things that's behind lock and key that I can't get to are razors that people are using every day. And the razor industry had been competing with itself and up-featuring itself for decades. So these two guys saw that as an opportunity and figured out they could create a new channel, a new sales channel, a new interface for people to buy razors through, And without creating a new razor at all, they didn't invent anything new. They simply changed the business model around getting a razor into your hands. They eventually sold that company to Unilever for $1 billion. And they never invented anything. They simply innovated the business model. So there are lots of places where you can impact the economy of both your business and the region without necessarily having to invent. So we think about innovation as a much larger scope, okay? So why do you innovate in the first place? There's a really good set of research papers that's been put out by these four gentlemen relatively recently. And what they started doing was looking at influential patents and looking at what the impact of those influential patents were on productivity growth. And as Kieran pointed out, productivity in the Caribbean region has been sort of stagnant since the 1970s. What these guys found is that as influential patents are released, it's usually followed by a period of significant economic growth and productivity. Now, understand that influential patents are different than any patents. They're very specific on how they define it, and now they're looking at other things like external influences around policy that are driving economic growth. But so far, their conclusion is innovation is the driver for economic growth in business, and those that are not following economic or for not innovating are not creating economic growth for themselves or their region. I highly recommend you go read this paper. It's a fascinating study, especially in the way that they've defined what they're looking at. So examples of this, and you can look at, this is one example. You can look all over. A quick Google search, you'll find that generally everybody across the world in every industry agrees that innovation drives economic growth throughout. So if you look at GDP per capita, and you look at, in this case, there's this arbitrary innovation score that this particular study was using, what you see is there is a strong relationship between these two. The more innovative the country, the stronger the GDP per capita becomes. And I pulled out one example from Britain because they did a more extensive study looking at how they can link their innovation effort back to economic growth, and found that 60% of their economic growth throughout the country is tied to innovation. In the US, we've seen those studies as well, and that's around 50%, and those numbers are generally the same worldwide. So it's an important thing to understand. So one of the things that we cover in corporate venturing is not simply how do we put you in front of a startup, but what we would also try to coach and educate all the participants, either in the existing corporates like yourselves or the startups that we're finding to partner, are innovation best practices. So innovation is often seen as a black box, right? It's sort of black magic in a way. So people think you're either good at it or you're not, and you're trying to find that unicorn out there you can hire that's really, really good at innovating, and that's how you're going to win. We don't subscribe to that theory. We think innovation can be, or we've proven that innovation can be turned into a process that has predictable results. The problem with innovation today is that people don't spend enough time upfront understanding how to interpret the markets they're walking into to determine whether or not the products and services that they think they should be offering are things that are actually going to return an economic impact. Okay, so if we look at a standard process that people think about when they do innovation, we see this, right? And this is what we see a lot of companies doing. Everything from starting at Googling market trends, say what's happening in the world, right? Making guesses on market share so we can make nice curves to make our economic analysts happy that, and business leaders happy that we're going to make a lot of money. Looking at who's doing what are we good at doing, what's our competition good at doing, and how do we differentiate ourselves? And then from that, formulate a product strategy. Unfortunately, this particular process ultimately leads to one strategy, and it's this: build, show, and hope. And this is the most expensive form of testing innovation and testing new ideas that you can use. So you build something, you show it to the people that you think you're going to be serving, and then you hope they're going to buy it. And usually the decision to build show and hope is based on insufficient data and assumptions that just don't bear out to be true in the market. So if we step back for a second and say, well, what are we really trying to do as a corporation when it comes to innovation? And we're really trying to do this. We're trying to do a good job of investigating opportunities, differentiating solutions through invention, and then implementing as part of the entire innovation spectrum. All right. And what we're ultimately trying to do is to get new ideas that have true market potential into the core business. And this is where we make our money, right? We make money in the core. So anything that we ultimately have as a core business that's selling, we have a known customer base, we're making money, that's what the business is designed to support. So everything to the left of that, everything from even evaluating capabilities and megatrends, all the way to generating new business models for new ideas, tend to be pushed to the side. The larger a company gets and the more mature their product line becomes and more accepted their product line becomes, because the business is designed to protect that core. So the question is, well, if we're making money in the core, why bother innovating at all? Right? Why do we even talk about innovation? Why do we need this engine of growth if we're already making money with our core business? And that's a really good question to ask. And the answer to it is summed up right here. Right? If you look at the Standard & Poor's data and you say from 1960 to 2020 and say, well, what's the average lifespan on the S&P 500 index in number of years? It's now down to 20, and it's estimated to go lower than that as we move forward, right? We're trending lower. It used to be large companies would exist for hundreds of years, but the pace at which invention is occurring and the pace at which innovation is occurring side by side is causing companies to disappear at an increasingly rapid rate because markets are changing underneath them and they're not able to respond quickly enough. So the reality of this is that 40% of today's leading businesses are facing extinction within the next decade. So corporate venturing is potentially one of the methods of innovation that's the key to getting around this problem. And of course, all innovation is going to help. In this particular program, we're focused on corporate venturing specifically. So let's talk about that for just a second. So what is corporate venturing in the first place? Corporate venturing is actually a catch-all phrase that's talking about multiple different ways of innovating. And if you look at here and you look at a timeline between long-term impact and mid-term impact, you're looking at cost, right, use of capital. You say, where are we talking in the corporate world? Corporate venturing goes anywhere from simply sharing resources with a partner or having hackathons and challenge prizes, which are fun and interesting and good to come up with new ideas, but do not have very long-term impacts, all the way to merger and acquisition. All of that is under the umbrella of corporate venturing. Within this program, what we're specifically focused on trying to enable is this one in the middle over strategic partnership. Now, the reason for that is a strategic partnership can be tailored to a number of different types of businesses, different business models, different sizes of businesses. And it's also something that is more manageable over time than some of these other methodologies. For example, if you're looking at acquisition or you're looking at corporate venture capital, those things are typically only taken on by very large companies that have the bandwidth and the capital to invest in companies. It's not something that's really available to companies that, in our experience, are less than $3 to $4 billion in size. So what we're looking at as strategic partnerships is a way to drive economic growth from the bottom up through the region. And this is the direction that Compete Caribbean decided to go. We think it's the right direction for the region, and this is what we're going to enable to occur. So why then, if we're talking about strategic partnerships within this, under this umbrella of corporate venturing, then why bother at all? What's the point of corporate venturing? Why would we bother going through the effort in the first place? Well, First of all, it allows you to have a faster response to market changes. The reason for that is that the larger a business gets, the skill sets and the processes they develop in order to protect that core business and to continue to operate actually become the Achilles heel. They're designed to slow things down. They're designed to make sure that core business does not get adversely affected. So as a result, the ability to address rapid changes in a market get diminished the larger a business gets. So by going into strategic partnerships with smaller entities, small to medium enterprises and startups, et cetera, allow you to respond faster to market changes in a much more economical way. It also gives you a better view of threats. We're going to describe the steps of this process at the end of today's webinar. And what you're going to find is that it's not simply, we're going to go find a startup who seems to be able to have a solution to what you're talking about doing, and then enable the structural integration of those two in that partnership. A large part of the beginning of this program is teaching the corporations how to better go define and validate the problem that they're trying to solve in the first place. Make sure that what you're doing is going to have the economic impact that you want it to have. Because if it doesn't, frankly, you're wasting your time and you're wasting your money and you're wasting the time and the money of the startup that you engage. So by going through this process in a way that we've designed this program, you get a better view of what are the disruptive threats, who's doing what out there, what does the competitive landscape actually look like? So you can make better, objective, data-driven decisions on what to innovate, where to innovate, and how to move forward. Easier disengagement from investments. What that means is it's similar to, for example, hiring let's say a consulting engineer or salesperson or manager for a short amount of time on a project. If that project works out, you have the opportunity to bring that person on full time and move forward. If it doesn't work out, it's easy to walk away from that relationship. So in a strategic partnership perspective, you're not necessarily acquiring a company yet. You're not necessarily investing in a company yet. You're investing sweat equity. But if things start to go south and you determine this is not going to have the impact we want it to have, it's much easier to disengage from that particular effort than if you did this entirely internally. If you were to build an innovation team, invest internally into developing technology, et cetera, there's a certain amount of sunk cost in that effort that makes it very hard to walk away. So this makes it a much easier way to investigate different types of opportunities in a way that doesn't hamstring the business to committing on a direction early. Amplification of investment impact. This is true across the board. So the startups that you're looking at are people that are trying to create new businesses. You may be representative of enough business for that startup to keep them alive. You may not be. But the point is that they are trying to find investment themselves. They're putting in sweat equity, et cetera, without necessarily you investing in them from day one. The other part of this is there are also, right now, especially in Jamaica, and we can talk about, I don't know if we have that as part of our agenda today, but there are opportunities in Jamaica specifically to find additional investment as a result of having some of these partnerships. So it allows you to amplify your corporate investment in innovation by finding external funding, by using sweat equity of startups as well, in partnerships, et cetera. So it allows you to move faster in a more efficient way. It also provides experimental and risk-tolerant progress. The larger a corporation becomes, the less risk-tolerant they become in terms of moving in new directions. The less experimental companies become, all because they're trying to protect that core business, which is the right thing to do strategically, is to protect the core, but it's at the expense of being experimental and risk-tolerant. Startups don't have a core yet, so they're much more risk-tolerant. They can try new things. They're more aggressive in experimenting in new directions, new markets, new ideas. So it allows you to leverage that kind of culture without necessarily having to adopt it full time for the entire corporation. And then finally, of course, it's a way to do product development as well as talent development outside of the normal processes of the business. So if you happen to be a corporation that's not regularly engaged in product development, those are processes that are difficult to bring on to simply solve one problem or two problems a year. It requires resources, training, experience, et cetera, that you may not have the wherewithal to maintain. We see this all the time in companies that have very stable core businesses. There's not a lot of product development going on. Likewise, talent development to move into those areas is difficult to do if you don't have those departments building in real time. So using these relationships with startups and small to medium enterprises through corporate venturing is a way to do product development and talent development outside of normal processes in a way that then allows rapid corporate growth, presuming that a solution is validated and the opportunity is validated. So if we go back to this model and we say the real goal of innovation is to migrate new ideas that are associated with validated opportunities and megatrends into the core business, then the question therefore is the partners that we're talking about working with in the startup world, how does their best practice differ? And it only really differs in this last bubble, right? Instead of trying to migrate to a core, startups and small business are looking for a core. They don't necessarily have a core business yet. Their core business is innovation because they're trying to leverage opportunities in the market. But otherwise, they're fundamentally doing the same things. And what that means is that the language and the tools and the ways of doing these upfront activities between evaluating capabilities through assessing market needs and creating solutions generally look the same. But unfortunately, both in existing corporations and in startups, what we typically see when we look at the innovation processes that are currently in place is this is what it looks like, right? This goes back to the build, show, and hope model, which is we look at megatrends and we say, well, what do we have and what can we do that address megatrends? And then you look at your in-kind competition and say, well, what are they doing? What do they have? And then immediately differentiate features to make your solution look different, and then try to migrate to the core. And you skip over these steps of scoping opportunities and assessing market needs. There are lots of assumptions that make companies feel good that they already know this information, and they skip over it. And as a result, they miss the real opportunity, and they create solutions that fundamentally no one really cares that much about. And at the end of the day, those things are sitting on the shelf, tooled up, ready to go, and everybody's looking at each other wondering why no one cares, why the sales are not where they need to be. And I mention this both from what we've seen in corporations we've worked with over the years, but I also mention it from our own experience. I mentioned that both Edmund and I are entrepreneurs ourselves. We're just as guilty of doing this as anybody else. We've lived this for many, many years. In product development, I've worked in about every industry. And I did this for probably 10 years before I realized that I was really skipping over these steps, assuming that I already knew what turned out I did not know. So what do we do in this program? And I mentioned there's an educational portion and a validation portion for both corporations and startups separately in the beginning of this program to validate that the problems and the challenges that you're trying to partner to solve are really going to have the economic impact you want them to be. So we focus a lot on this area right here. And we use specific tools, both that you may have read some resources around things like jobs to be done or design thinking or lean startup, et cetera. We synthesize a lot of those methodologies. We have some tools and methods that we've developed on our own ourselves over the last 7 years that allow you to get through this process in an objective, data-driven way. And the reason that's important is that if you have a data-driven, objective assessment of what the market looks like, you have a much higher likelihood of succeeding when pushing your innovation out to the market. Understanding this is the exact same thing that the startups are trying to do. So the question then becomes, as you're moving through this process, and either you're a large corporation migrating to the core or you're a startup that's simply trying to define a core, then if you're both doing the same thing, what's the point of partnering, right? Why do you need a startup? Why does a startup need a large corporation, right? Why does that partnership beneficial at all? I know many people may be thinking to yourselves from a corporation perspective, I've met people in startups, they don't know how to run a business, right? It's the startup culture, right? It's ping pong tables and beanbag chairs. And in a large way, you're actually correct. But in both cases of the existing corporation and the startups, there are benefits, there are pros, and there are cons to both of those models. So let's talk about those real quickly. If we look at the traits of business operation and we compare what you as an existing corporate looks like as compared to a startup through the lens of, is this beneficial for innovation? You see a very interesting story get created. So if you look at risk tolerance, we already talked about that one, right? Corporate culture and existing corporation is there to protect that core, right? So your risk tolerance is very low. Startups will do anything. Their risk tolerance is very, very high because they have to be rapid, they have to take risks, and it's not just there, but it has to be there in order for them to succeed. They have to be risk tolerant. So they're willing to try things that existing corporations may not. If you look at dedication of human resources, the larger a corporation becomes, the more difficult it is to create innovation teams and keep them healthy. And we tell people all the time, you need to try to isolate and insulate your innovation teams from the core business. Because inevitably what happens, if there's a fire drill, which there always are in protecting the core, you look for your best people to pull them in to fix the problem that's happening in the core. And the reality is that when you look for an innovation team and say, I want my best and brightest to be innovating for the company, the people that you bring in for the fire drill and the people that you want to be innovating are typically the same people. So those people are not dedicated to the innovation team. Meanwhile, in a startup, 100% of the people in the startup are dedicated and focused on innovation. That's what they do. The whole business is designed around working on the innovation. So they are an innovation team with nowhere else to be pulled to, right? So they're a dedicated resource. If you look at change tolerance as well, similar thing, right? Layered management structures tend to increase the friction in established companies around change of any kind, right? The whole purpose of building a corporate structure is to minimize the change because you're trying to protect the core business. In the case of startups, the lack of established processes, right, and established management structure, et cetera, allow them to change very rapidly. So you have the founders and the CEO and maybe the CFO or CTO making day-to-day decisions that may change the direction of those companies. And they can change that quickly because they're small and they lack the infrastructure overhead that prevents larger corporations from changing rapidly. In terms of decision making, this is where corporations start winning, right? So corporations are very good at making well-informed, data-driven decisions. They tend to defer large commitments in favor for more research and analysis to understand the impact of those decisions across the entire enterprise. Startups, on the other hand, and again, Ed and I are both guilty of this in a couple of our startups, you chase the shiny object, right? Because what you're looking for is money to stay in business. So you're willing to change focus, move directions, et cetera, as long as you're keeping the doors open. And that kind of decision making does not work very well for an established company. And established companies in general are much better at making objective decisions. In financial resources, large corporations have typically much more stable financial resources to put towards innovation. Startups are always looking for the next dollar, right? They're not yet even revenue positive. So from a financial resources perspective, corporations are much better positioned to work on new things, even though it's difficult for them to make the decision to divert some of those financial resources to innovation. Focus and vision, same thing. Large corporations are very focused, have already established visions. They understand the values of the company. How do you make decisions? What's important to the corporation? And they're consistent and they're controlled. Startups, on the other hand, are at risk all the time of changing their focus and vision. One of the hardest things about managing startups is keeping them focused and keeping them on their existing vision. So corporations win here as well. And then finally, I'm sorry, there are two more. So here on basic processes, right? Finance, HR, legal, obviously those are in place in existing corporation. You have them as resources, you know how to use them, and you're educated on what their purpose is and why they need to be there. Often startups have no idea what they're doing in these spaces. They've got one founder who is trying to learn this stuff on the fly, and like we like to say, they're building the plane while they fly it. They really don't know what they're doing. Sometimes they get themselves in trouble as a result, but they just don't know how to manage some of these basic business processes. And then finally, from a values perspective, right? Now, values in this case, it doesn't mean like moral values. It has more to do with how do companies prioritize what they're doing. And oftentimes, a large company prioritizes its decision-making based upon what is best for the core, right? What is best for the core? What's best for the investors if you're a publicly owned company, or even privately owned if you have a board of directors, et cetera? What is going to create the return that's expected? And as a result, small opportunities on day one do not look attractive. It's hard to put resources towards internal development of seemingly small opportunities today, even if there's a potential growth curve, because it doesn't change the needle for the bottom line. Whereas startups make decisions that are based on survival, right? So they'll do anything they can, they'll take any job they can, because small opportunities to a startup are very large for them. So anything looks attractive. So as a result, what you notice from this chart is that places where large businesses have a difficult time innovating, startups are very good at doing. And startups where they struggle as businesses and as innovators, large companies are good at doing. So if you manage a relationship in a strategic partnership around innovation and leverage the things that are in green and try to control the things that are in red on both sides of the equation, you can create a very effective and very successful partnership. So you as a corporation can leverage the craziness of a startup. And we tell people all the time when we work with large corporations, you have to start thinking like a startup. But at the same time, we cross the fence and we're working with startup companies and academics, and we say, you need to start thinking like a large business. You need to understand what it's going to take to go from being a startup to being a real business. And we've worked with a lot of startups who've said we've been a startup for the last 7 years. We've had a startup. And Ed and I like to look at them and say, well, actually, you were a startup for 2 years and you were been a failure for 5, because you haven't been able to make this transition of moving those red things into green as being a real business. And this is a natural migration. So it's a good way to leverage these partnerships to get the best of both of these worlds working together. And of course, the danger and what we're here to help do during this process is to prevent all of the red things from working in concert in a negative way. Now, a couple of real quick case studies. They're not long, just a couple of short things to show you what these things might look like. The first one is we were just calling them big chemical company. I'm not at liberty to tell you what company this was, but it's someone that we've worked with in the United States. And they were in industrial wastewater for years. And they were noticing a trend that most of the growth was in the municipal wastewater industry. They said, well, we have no toehold. We have nothing for that industry, and they do things very differently. For the industrial wastewater, their technology was based in membranes. And that's not what was happening in municipal water. Their municipal water was all around this idea of using activated sludge to do wastewater treatment. And the question they were trying to answer was, well, how do we take our technology and apply it, if possible, or something that's in our domain, how do we apply it to municipal water so that we can get into that market? And what they did is they started looking at who was working in this space, what startups were in this space, and they found a startup that had technology that they were trying to apply membrane technology to municipal water. And together, in this case, they worked to go out and validate that there was an opportunity here. And I'll show you one of their outputs here. And this is an output that there's a lot of data behind here. And this is one of the things that we get people to do during this process. They say, well, if we look at wastewater treatment municipal customers, and the question is, well, what users of activated sludge are telling us when we go into the market and start validating what folks are actually doing, we find out that there are certain things that are very, very important to municipal wastewater that they're very unsatisfied with activated sludge as a solution. And it has to do with maintenance, sludge volumes, nutrient removals, and footprints. And what came out of that was a drop-in solution into some of these activation tanks using membranes that would take care of some of these underserved needs or underserved metrics around what these municipal wastewater treatment folks were doing. So what happened? Well, the startup had the capability and the IP. So they went through a co-development process. They eventually started putting, the large company, big chem company, put in equity investment to keep that startup building the solution, and was hands off in large with the technology development because they did not want to force them through the regular big company's product development cycle because they wanted to move faster than that. So they increased their speed to market. And ultimately, this resulted in an acquisition where a big chem company bought the small company and created its own business unit that is now making money for them. A second example would be out of actually one of my own startups, where we developed some hearing protection, advanced controls for hearing protection for the folks that are working on flight decks for the US Navy. And what we were trying to do is protect people's hearing when the Joint Strike Fighter came online. And we started looking around for early on, who could we simply sell the technology to? And we were too small. Nobody wanted to do the development. So what we ultimately did is we partnered, we got into a strategic partnership, sort of through a corporate venturing type of program that was sponsored by the US government, but it was with Lockheed Martin, who actually taught us as a startup how to act as a large company. What would we have to look like in order for Lockheed Martin to be interested? And then also early on in the process, we also partnered with another DoD supplier who was much smaller than Lockheed Martin, but was focused on personal protective equipment, which is what we were in. And through both of those relationships, we learned how to interface with the government and these large suppliers. Lockheed Martin was able to acquire technology they needed to go with the plane. They didn't want to acquire the company because we meant nothing to Lockheed Martin, right? Innovation for Lockheed Martin is creating a new airplane, not creating a hearing protector. So they didn't care about us, but who did care was the small personal protective equipment company. And ultimately what happened, our first collaboration was in 2008. And by 2014, we had a successful acquisition where we got acquired by Gentex Corporation. Now, there are lots of other things about this story that if you participate in this program, we'll use as examples and you'll learn more about. But both of those are examples where a small company and large companies came together and leveraged each other in order to make a mutually beneficial relationship.